Everyone thought the fallen billionaire had vanished in shame, until a spilled cup of coffee, a small-town barista, and a 3-minute viral clip began unraveling the lie that destroyed his life. If you're settling in to listen, stay with me until the end. I'd love to know where you're listening from in the comments, and there will be a quick rating prompt at the finish. The mug left the counter in slow motion, as if someone had finally given gravity permission. Noah Grant had seen worse slow-motion things on corporate broadcasts, stock tickers sliding, trust graphs collapsing, so he knew how a moment could be rearranged afterward like spilled sugar. The latte hit the sleeve of his sweater and splashed onto the table between him and the woman who ran Sunrise Roast, who was already apologizing before the first dark hit the wood. "I'm so sorry," Sophie Hart said, cheeks high with a kind of earnestness that made ordinary mistakes feel almost deliberate. Paper towel, napkins, a mop? I can make you a new one, or—" Noah looked at the coffee spreading across his lap, the warm brown seeping into the knit, and found that his automatic reflex, his practiced executive reflex, was to count what the stain might cost to replace. Then he surprised himself by laughing, a small sound that had the shape of an almost smile. It did not reach his eyes, but it bent his mouth in a way he hadn't allowed it to for months. Sophie was narrowing the distance at once, sleeves pushed up, apron dotted with a constellation of past spills. "Sit, don't move. Hannah," she called toward the back with theatrical urgency. "We have a code brown in Sector Noah." Ruby, at the register, snorted and hid her phone behind the pastry case. Noah should have minded being called by his first name. He had been called Mr. Grant in headlines and in the legal notices. The world continued to prefer formality where it could. Formal accusations, formal apologies, formal resignations stapled to press releases. Here, with coffee seeping at his knees and a woman who hummed while she fetched towels, the formality felt absurd, a costume he had stopped wanting to wear. He had been careful since the fall. Careful with his face in public, careful in what he said to strangers. He had let his suits go, traded collars for sweaters, collars for the neat, worn sweater he now wore. He came to Sunrise Roast because Evelyn, his mother, had insisted he leave his apartment for at least an hour every morning. Fresh air, she'd said. People, not the television. Evelyn had driven him here once, taken his hand at the door like she was pushing him into the light. At 60-ish, with hair still the soft iron of an old photograph and a voice that could both prod and soothe, she carried the belief that life demanded stubborn little routines. Noah had allowed this one. Sophie cleaned with the kind of gentle ferocity that made small rooms smell like lemon and flour. The espresso machine hissed. Bread came warm from the oven, its crusting sound breaking the soft clatter. Sunrise Roast's sign swung on a wrought iron hook above the window, a painted sun with a coffee cup at its center, some little bird's flight of yellow on the pane. The place felt like a patchwork quilt of someone else's happier memories, stitched by people who believed in mornings. Noah watched Sophie pull another cloth across the table, and then, with a steadier hand than he expected, hand him a steaming replacement cup. "On the house," she said, "because accidents are rude enough without the bill." He wanted to correct her, that he could pay, that he didn't want charity, but instead he accepted the mug. It smelled like a new beginning, in a small, reasonable way. Cinnamon, milk, a trace of something sharp and dark. He lifted it, and the gesture made an almost smile flicker again, like a moth caught briefly in a porch light. Ruby winked at him from behind the register, as if she were in on an inside joke the city had forgotten to tell him. Sophie filled the air with talk as she wiped. "You come here every morning, same seat, window. I thought you were an art critic at first. No, wait, that makes no sense. You look like you could own an art museum." She laughed at her own rambling, and sat on the stool opposite him for a beat, as if she had permission. A beat was all Noah had to bargain for. He had been guarding himself for months, listening for the squeal of reporters, for the rustle of a story finding its way into someone's morning feed. The headlines had called him everything from fallen wonderkind to accountability symbol. None of those words fit the man who had once stayed late to fix a product line because he couldn't stand a bug that kept customers from finishing a task. He did not say that aloud. He allowed Sophie to occupy the space with small talk. "My grandmother stitched that cup," Sophie said suddenly, pointing at a chipped little ceramic mug near the register, the one with a sun emblem hand-embroidered on a cloth sleeve. "She used to say, 'Never throw away a cup that remembers you.'" She brushed a laugh off her shoulder. "We keep it on the shelf for people who look like they need to remember." Noah found himself studying that embroidered cup, its thread worn into soft loops shaped by many hands. He understood the impulse, not to be remembered by headlines, but by a mug someone set aside because the mug had learned the shape of the owner's fingers. The almost smile lingered a measure longer. From the kitchen, Hannah called, "Sophie, you saved a cinnamon roll for me." Sophie shouted back, mock bureaucratic, "Official count says 1 cinnamon roll for Hannah Hart, daytime quota fulfilled." Ruby chimed in, "Official rumor says Noah is enamel-coated. Please don't spill more of life on him." The staff banter wrapped the room in a domestic warmth that Noah hadn't felt since his boardroom, the old boardroom that now, in his memory, smelled of disinfectant and formaldehyde conversation. Evelyn sat near the back, a plain teacup at her hands, watching him with the patient look of someone who had seen a child fall and refused to make the landing into a spectacle. She had told the barista to keep an eye on him. She had brought a sweater in case he grew cold. The sight of her there, soft-collared and resolute, made something unclench in him. Sophie, listening, tilted her head. "You know her?" she asked. Noah nodded. "My mother." Sophie brightened in the particular way she had for people who were possible allies. "Oh, she's about to be your neighborhood agent of shame if you keep being mysterious. People in this area are nosy but harmless, mostly." She grinned. "Ruby's harmless until you ask for extra whipped cream without paying." Noah let himself laugh again. It sounded easier here, as if laughter had been a muscle that just needed warming. He took a sip of his new cup, and the coffee was unexpectedly good, balanced, thoughtful, like someone who had finally learned to tune a machine by ear. He studied the steam as it braided itself upward and thought about the way images in his old life had been braided into the public record. The announcement on the stock ticker, the CFO's resignation that had come with an indictment, the whispers about missing funds. Colin Drake's name had appeared like lightning across corporate filings. Colin, the CFO, who professed loyalty until the numbers suggested otherwise. Colin, who had the sense to disappear into plausible deniability. Noah had been blamed for what Colin had done, and the world, hungry for a figure to point at, had obliged. He didn't say any of this. He told Sophie, "I come here because it's quieter than my apartment." "You could move into yours and be quieter," Sophie said, "but then you'd miss my terrible playlist." She glanced toward Ruby, who was pretending to curate a dramatic soundscape on her phone, and Hannah's politics in pastry form. Noah liked ordinary things about her, the way she mispronounced some fancy coffees, the way she hummed while rolling dough, the quickness with which she straightened chairs for customers who had forgotten what they were doing. Ordinary kindnesses had a way of making extraordinary situations tolerable. Over the next week, the ritual warmed into something like routine. Noah came, sat at the same window table, pretended to read, but mostly watched people crossing the street, watched the river blink in light beyond glass. Sophie learned his order, black, no sugar, and changed it on a whim with a cappuccino sometimes when she thought he needed to try something softer. It was a small act of rebellion against the narrative that had been written about him, that he was abrupt, that he could evaporate empathy, that he had no room for softness. Each time she set the cup down, the almost smile tremor returned and then retreated. Ruby and Hannah were the chorus to his slow days. Ruby, with a sharp opinion about everything and an even sharper tongue for anyone who dared to gossip about someone she liked, filled the register with mock superhero poses and conspiratorial texts. Hannah, steady and practical, kept the kitchen in order and Noah's napkins dry. Evelyn came often enough to become part of the furniture. She worked the crossword daily and gave Noah knowing looks that said, without words, "You can stand up for yourself." The town, small enough that news traveled faster than any official statement, had opinions. They were not always kind. A blog had printed a list of alleged failings. Someone had posted a timeline of missing funds in a forum that read like a thriller's spoiler. Noah had been in the middle of a life that suddenly belonged to other people's imaginations. He did not correct those imaginations. To correct them would have been to re-expose himself to headlines. One slow Wednesday, as autumn browned the leaves, a man at the corner table leaned forward and said something under his breath about the billion-dollar mistake. His voice carried. People listened. Noah felt the room tilt toward him with the weight of idle curiosity. He kept his face blank. Sophie, however, stepped closer without thinking. "Hey," she said, loud enough for the man and the nearest table to hear, "maybe don't make jokes about people you don't know. They don't make your coffee any better." The man bristled. "Excuse me?" Sophie braced her hands on the counter like a small sheriff. "No, you heard me. If you're going to take up air in this shop, take up manners too." Her tone was fierce and ridiculous in equal measure. Ruby's eyes shone with mischief. Hannah's shoulders found their posture, ready for escalation. Noah watched Sophie stand there, unarmed, except for the indignation of a person who refused to let cruelty be casual. It was a small, honest bravery. Someone at a nearby table, a student with long hair and a steady hand, raised their phone. Ruby's head snapped toward the register. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, but she didn't move to stop it. The student panned the camera, caught the exchange, and uploaded in a matter of minutes, less time than it took a croissant to cool. The clip was clean. Sophie defending a man, the man with eyes like someone who had been stung, and a mother in the back smiling like a private son. Noah had spent months shrinking away from attention. Now attention leaned in, curious and hungry, and its appetite was unpredictable. He could have asked Sophie to stop, to pretend nothing had happened. Instead, she looked at him afterward with a flush of embarrassment, then with a secret smile that acknowledged she had done something she could not quite explain. When the clip landed on whatever wide place clips go to be seen, it carried with it the smell of cinnamon and the sound of an espresso machine. For once, the narrative that threaded him through the world was one of a man in a cafe being treated with basic decency. People began to comment, not in the way that had once declared him guilty, but with a softness that surprised him. "She defended him," someone wrote. "That's how the world should be." The spike of attention was not an earthquake, it was a ripple. But ripples gathered, and as Noah watched the small wave move, he felt a question rise in his chest. Could kindness be a form of repair? Could a community's small insistence on decency undo what rumor had done? He didn't know. He only knew that the almost smile that had been a tremor for months was now a little less shy. He had, in his life, been defined by numbers and quarterly goals. Now he was being defined by the length of a pause and the steadiness of a woman's voice. He did not yet have a roadmap for justice. He had, for the first time in a long time, people in his corner. As the comments multiplied, Sophie kept making coffee, humming tunelessly, wiping tables, asking if he'd like a slice of banana bread on the house. Ruby announced to the universe that she would be launching her own unofficial journalism branch, Ruby Investigations, with a crusty notebook and a red pen. Hannah labeled things in the kitchen with cheerful exactness. The town took notice in a way that felt less hungry and more curious than the media had been. A neighborly curiosity that asked for truth before judgment. But curiosity could be a double-edged spoon. Some threads in the comments tried to pull old narratives back into place, whispering about missing numbers and convenient scapegoats. Colin Drake's name remained a shadow, one that might retard the healing if it were allowed to keep falling. Noah, who had been careful as a man who'd known falling, found that being looked at kindly was almost more dangerous than being looked at cruelly. He had to learn the muscle of accepting help without letting himself be consumed by it. He had to accept that someone like Sophie could change the mood of a day and also might be the first person to help him pick up what had been strewn. That afternoon, while the city smelled of rain and the shop glowed with warm light, the phone clip showed the 3-minute moment on repeat. People had given it a kind of softness online. Comments like humanity and this made me cry, likes stacking like saucers on a shelf. Ruby, watching the numbers tick, whooped like someone who'd won a small battle, then pretended to give a scholarly talk on viral ethics. Noah sat by the window, the embroidered cup Sophie had pointed out tucked safely on the top shelf in his mind. He traced the rim of his own mug with a fingertip, each pass a minor reassurance. The almost smile came again, and this time it lasted long enough that someone across the street might have seen it and thought the man was laughing at a private joke with the sky. The phone in the corner dinged. A new message. "We need to talk," it said, from an address Noah recognized, a former board member, a neutral voice in a storm. Evidence had a way of speaking when it was ready, and some people were beginning to listen for its cadence. Noah folded his hands around the warmth of his cup and listened to the hum of the shop, the machine, the clink of china, the private conversations that felt like knitting. He felt for the first time in months as if something might be being mended that wasn't just public relations. Sophie wiped down the table and slipped him a napkin with a doodle of a sun in the corner. "Keep that," she said. "It's not official, but it's good for memory." Her voice was soft and precise. She didn't know what she had started. She only knew what she had done. Outside, the sky was the color of a well-steeped tea, neither harsh nor forgiving, just wide. The sunrise roast sign swung gently as if nodding in approval. Someone in the shop laughed, Ruby again, and the sound fell around Noah like a small benediction. The ripple was beginning to find its edges. The question that hung in the air was simple and human. If someone proved you were not the villain you were accused of being, would people let the truth replace the rumor? The question would not be answered by likes or comments. It would require time, attention, and evidence. It would require a stubbornness that matched Colin Drake's cleverness. Noah sipped and tried, for one careful breath, to believe that small kindnesses on their own could not be the only thing to save a reputation. They could, however, be scaffolding. They could be the first hands to hold him steady before the truth arrived. He looked at Sophie as she moved through the shop, hands flour-dusted, eyes bright, and felt something lighter than resignation. There was work to be done, and also, unexpectedly, room to laugh. Later that afternoon, as the shop closed and the river outside took on the color of a low lamp, a customer who had been quiet all day stood as if remembering something. "I think I can help," he said. He had been a contractor who'd met Colin for a ledger handover, a small, improbable witness. He would not replace a formal audit, but he had a receipt and a memory. He put a small envelope on the table and left without fanfare. Hannah opened it, and her face tightened in a way that suggested possibility. Noah's fingers hovered over the envelope, as if touching fragile glass. He was, slowly, and with the cautious optimism people reserve for injured things, beginning to gather proof. The almost smile tremor returned, this time accompanied by a new note, determination shaped like sunlight on a cup. Some things still hurt. Trust, once broken, is not easily patched. But outside, in a city that still liked stories, a tiny counter-narrative had begun to swell. Sunrise Roast had become, by accident and choice, a place where people could see the human beneath the headline. It was not justice, it was not victory, it was a movement toward both, foot by careful foot. And as the evening settled, someone, Ruby, likely, posted another short clip. Sophie handing Noah a napkin with a sun doodled on it, the embroidered cup on the shelf in the background, Evelyn smiling like she had nothing to fear. The comments were quieter now, thoughtful. A woman wrote, simply, "I hope he gets the truth." Noah looked up at Sophie, and for the first time since the fall, he let himself imagine a morning that started with a cup set in front of him by someone who did not flinch at the stain of his past. He put his cup down and, without quite meaning to, reached out and set his hand over hers on the table. Her fingers were warm, her elbow powdered with flour. Her smile was immediate and candid, like a sunrise. For a breath, the almost smile became something that might be called a first true smile. A ding from Ruby's laptop drew their attention. A direct message from a journalist, cautiously respectful, asking if Noah would consider speaking to them. It was not an offer of vindication. It was an invitation to step into light with a prepared question. Noah looked at the envelope on the table, and then at Sophie, who cocked her head as if waiting to see what he would do. He thought of Evelyn, of the contractor's receipt, of the small stitches of kindness that had kept him from fraying. He thought of the almost smile that had been his constant companion for months, and how it had slowly, stubbornly softened. Maybe, he said, and for once the word felt like a door opening. Maybe it's time to see what the truth looks like in public. Sophie squeezed his hand. "We'll make you a good cup for it," she said. "Something softer, a cappuccino of fortitude." The laugh that came then was a real laugh, not merely an almost smile in disguise. For the first time in a long time, Noah felt as if a road might exist after all, one paved with cups and witness, and the slow, patient work of people who would not let rumor be the last word. Outside the window, the river reflected a thin strip of orange. Inside, the shop hummed on. Red and gold leaves scudded past the glass. Somewhere, a phone alarm reminded someone to be kind. The world quietly rearranged toward a possibility that truth and tenderness might find each other at a small wooden table with a napkin sun-doodled in the corner. Not every story fixes itself neatly, but in that space between a spill and a smile, something had begun. The question was no longer whether kindness could matter, only whether it would be enough. Morning came thin and patient, as if the city itself had been taught to be careful around new things. Light slanted through the tall windows of Sunrise Roast, catching on coffee steam and the dust that lived in the beams. Sophie arrived before the shop opened, hair in a messy knot, apron already flour-dusted, carrying a small tin with cookies she'd baked for anyone who might wander in and need a hand. She set the tin on the counter and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to make comfort out of heat and rhythm. Noah watched her from the back room where he had found a corner to sit. The envelope lay on the table like a thing that ought to be fragile, and in some ways it was. Fragile because it contained the kind of proof rumor could not eat, but fragile too because proof was only the beginning of other actions. Meetings, documents, witnesses, all the slow, bureaucratic tying of threads. He had folded and refolded the paper until the edges softened beneath his fingers. He could feel the steadiness returning in small increments. A laugh that did not curdle, a glance that did not flee. Hannah arrived with a thermos and a notebook. She moved through the front with the precise calm of someone who had decided to be useful instead of anxious. Ruby was already at a corner table, laptop open, fingers pausing mid-flight as she read. The shop, usually a small theater for ordinary mornings, felt like a backstage before an event. There was, beneath the ordinary clatter and hiss, an energy that did not belong to headlines but to people aligning themselves quietly. The journalist arrived without flourish, early, attentive, and wearing shoes that left no echo. She introduced herself as Mara and set a recorder on the counter like an offering. She had read Ruby's posts and the little clip of Sophie handing Noah a napkin. She had read the comments that had shifted from condemnation to a kind of guarded curiosity. She had also read, when Ruby had pressed a folded piece of paper into her hands, the contractor's note and receipt. It was never one thing alone, Mara said. It was always a constellation. She wanted to draw the map with them, if they would let her. Noah stood when she asked where he preferred to sit. He gave no grand statements, no theatrical denials. He told his story the way someone might tell how a storm came in, noting the first wind, then the color of the clouds, then the things they lost. He spoke of the accusation, of how it had arrived like an animal scenting weakness, and how rumor had multiplied in spaces that craved narrative. He spoke, too, of the small kindnesses, Sophie's flower-streaked fingers, Hannah's steady questionings, Ruby's determination to not let the story collapse into a punchline. Mara listened with the attention of someone who had chosen to be present without rushing to close anything. She asked about the contractor. Noah handed her the receipt. It was modest: address, date, a shorthand description of services rendered. It contradicted a timeline that had been offered in the more viral posts. The journalist arrived without flourish, early, attentive, and wearing shoes that left no echo. She introduced herself as Mara and set a recorder on the counter like an offering. She had read Ruby's posts and the little clip of Sophie handing Noah a napkin. She had read the comments that had shifted from condemnation to a kind of guarded curiosity. She had also read, when Ruby had pressed a folded piece of paper into her hands, the contractor's note and receipt. It was never one thing alone, Mara said. It was always a constellation. She wanted to draw the map with them, if they would let her. Noah stood when she asked where he preferred to sit. He gave no grand statements, no theatrical denials. He told his story the way someone might tell how a storm came in, noting the first wind, then the color of the clouds, then the things they lost. He spoke of the accusation, of how it had arrived like an animal scenting weakness, and how rumor had multiplied in spaces that crave narrative. He spoke, too, of the small kindnesses, Sophie's flower-streaked fingers, Hannah's steady questionings, Ruby's determination to not let the story collapse into a punchline. Mara listened with the attention of someone who had chosen to be present without rushing to close anything. She asked about the contractor. Noah handed her the receipt. It was modest: address, date, a shorthand description of services rendered. It contradicted a timeline that had been offered in the more viral posts. It did not, on its own, erase the earlier accusations, but it provided a new arc, a way for the pattern to be read differently. Mara asked if anyone else might corroborate. Noah named names in a low voice, names of people who had been idle witnesses, or, like the contractor, had kept small scraps that might someday matter. Outside, the city carried on with its own noise: buses, a dog's bark, a vendor haggling about lemons. Inside, the shop felt like a small chapel for evidence and for mercy. People drifted in, regulars who took coffee with their weather predictions, each offering a piece of the ordinary that artfully countered the extraordinary smear. An older man who had sat at the window for years remembered seeing Noah carefully handle the ledger that had been the center of the early confusion. A woman who worked 2 blocks away produced, almost shyly, a photograph from her phone, a printed receipt with Noah's name on it, dated months before the accusation. Each small object shored up the other. Word of Mara's presence traveled faster than usual. A patron posted a photo. Ruby reshared it with a caption that avoided triumph and instead asked for patience. The comments that returned were not all mercy. Some still barked suspicion, but many were gentler, curious in a way that felt like the first step away from certainty. When Mara left, she promised nothing grander than an honest airing. "I'll be careful," she said, "and if they're willing, I'll let them speak before I write." There was a simplicity in that promise that felt rarer than any headline, an agreement to let the truth work itself slowly, with witnesses, not as a performance. The first draft of her piece arrived the next afternoon. Ruby opened the link and read aloud in a voice that wavered only on the names. The article did not declare Noah innocent. It did not pretend miracles. It set out timelines, quoted receipts, included the contractor's plain paragraph about an exchange that had been entirely transactional. More importantly, it included human faces. Sophie describing the man she had known who made perfect cappuccinos, Hannah describing the ledger's oddities, and Evelyn, who spoke with a confidence that surprised Noah, saying she remembered a different version of events than the original post had implied. Mara had found nuance and left room for complexity. There was a small flurry after publication. Some readers sent corroborating notes. One woman in a neighboring neighborhood forwarded an email chain she had been saving that referenced a payment to the very contractor listed on the receipt. A local shopkeeper provided timestamps from a surveillance clip, a grainy monochrome thing that showed Noah in the shop on a date that contradicts a key detail of the allegation. Nothing was conclusive on its own. Together, the pieces began to make hands hold each other across a gap. A lawyer reached out, referral from a friend, offering a consult, on a sliding scale. He spoke with the careful frankness of someone who had seen similar wreckage and knew the difference between shaking the air and moving the machinery of officialdom. "There's a way to collect witness statements," he said. "There's a way to demand records. It's slow work, it's the kind that eats at rumor, but it's real." Noah agreed to meet him after the shop closed, and for the first time since the accusation, he allowed himself to think in terms of next steps rather than merely surviving the day. Yet even as things tilted toward the practical, damage sat like a scar that would not vanish overnight. Noah could already hear, beneath the small sound of testimony, the lingering static of those who would not be moved. Some patrons who had once knocked his elbow in passing kept their distance. There were mornings when the shop felt emptier, when the hiss of the espresso machine seemed to amplify the absence of certain faces. Sophie noticed these mornings in the way she tamped the grounds, with hands that spoke both tenderness and a contained anger at the unfairness of things. Evelyn, who had been quieter as the story unfolded, began to come in more often. She would sit at a small table by the shelf and fold and unfold her hands, watching the ritual of coffee making as if learning a new liturgy. She had her own reasons for being cautious. Shame is a contagious thing, but she also had the clarity of someone who had seen how gossip could be rectified by the gentle accumulation of truth. One afternoon, she handed Noah a sealed envelope containing a short, precise note. It was a memory she had been hoarding, the time she had seen a bank transfer confirmed, the time-stamped message that placed Noah in a different location than the one his accusers had claimed. It was not a dramatic thing to save a life. It was the small act of truth-telling that might, in composite, become decisive. Noah began to sleep in increments that felt like recovery, awakened often but with less dread. He spent his mornings at the counter, wiping down tables, practicing the way he would speak should anyone ask. He found, to his surprise, that being measured did not require him to pretend the wound had not been real. He could acknowledge the bruises and, at the same time, choose to hold testimony as a tool for mending. There were moments of exquisite ordinariness that steadied him. Sophie insisting he try a new blend she was testing. Ruby bringing in a small bouquet of thrift store flowers because she liked the way they reminded her of resilience. Hannah drafting a list of people to contact for statements. The city, in its softer edges, supplied witnesses and receipts and a small, usually unnoticed honesty. Neighbors who fixed each other's fences, bus drivers who remembered times and faces, baristas who recognized the sound of footsteps and could say, without drama, where someone had been. Then, one late afternoon, as the shop settled into the honeyed lull between rushes, Mara called.
"There's been a response," she said. Her voice was careful, the kind of cautious excitement that accompanies a turning tide. "Readers have sent documents. A few corroborating notes landed in my inbox. If you want to press further, people are willing to speak on record." Noah let the news wash through him. It felt like standing at a window and watching a dinghy that had been adrift finally begin to head for shore. He could see the shape of a path. The lawyer, statements, a small hearing perhaps where things could be laid out and examined. It would not be a dramatic exoneration in a single moment. It would be process, paper, patience, but it would be progress. He looked up at Sophie, who had been listening from the counter where she had been wiping a cup. Her face held the steady, fierce warmth that had become his anchor. "We'll go as far as you want," she said. "We'll keep making the place where you come back to. Whatever comes next, you won't walk it alone." Noah reached for the napkin with the sundoodle and smoothed it between his fingers. The drawing had begun as a small joke, a way Sophie had of brightening faces that had forgotten how to look forward. Now it felt like a talisman, a modest emblem of the life he hoped to reclaim. Not a headline, but a morning with a cup, a person who believed his words, the slow countenance of neighbors who would name what they had seen. That night, after the rush had faded and only a few lamps outside blinked like distant stars, Noah sat alone in the shop. The envelope was open across the table. Threads of paper, emails printed and pinned, a photograph of a ledger, a note from the contractor. Each piece was small, human, unglamorous. He arranged them in a ragged line and, like a man arranging flowers, felt each one's weight. He did not know if it would be enough to overturn the harm done. He did not know how many times rumor could be undone by truth. He only knew that for the first time he could imagine the end of the sentence that had begun with the accusation. His phone buzzed, a message from Mara with a brief line. "They want to meet. The district office. Tuesday morning. Are you ready?" He read the message twice. Outside, a truck idled briefly, then hummed away. Inside, the shop smelled of lemon oil and roasted beans. Noah breathed in and let the steam of his next cup rise in the late, careful air. He put the napkin sun back beside the envelope. The path ahead was narrow and long, but it was there. He typed a one-word response and paused only a moment before sending it. Yes. He pressed send and set the phone face down on the table, as if by not watching it, he could keep the answer from collapsing under its own weight. Sophie came and sat opposite him without a question, picking up the napkin sun and tracing the thin ink lines with a fingertip. For a long moment, they sat like that, the two of them breathing in the same small room of light.
Morning arrived in a slow, sure way. Dawn, to Noah, felt less like a shove and more like an accumulation. He slept, woke, dressed, ran a hand through hair still stubborn with sleep and worry. Ruby arrived early with a paper bag of scones and the bouquet she had found on a walk, a handful of worn garden roses and a sprig of something green and peppery. "They were asking for you," she said, handing him a scone. "They said yes if you want to go. Then they looked at me like, 'Can you make the coffee too?'" She smiled at Sophie and then at Hannah, who came in with a stack of papers and a clasped pencil like a baton. Hannah had organized the statements into folders, labeled, clipped, annotated. Her handwriting was small and efficient. "I called everyone on my list," she said. "I told them the time and what to expect. I read them the questions they might be asked. I told them not to be intimidated. The person you'll see is just someone who wants to know the truth." She paused, watching Noah, then added, "Mara says, be honest, be concise. Don't tell stories you didn't live." They drove together, 4 people in the small car that still smelled faintly of coffee from Sophie's thermos. The city woke around them, a courier balancing a stack of packages, a bus exhaling passengers, a dog straining at its leash toward a patch of sun. Conversation was minimal. It pooled into small acts of preparation. Sophie straightened Noah's collar at a red light. Ruby told a joke about a pigeon that had decided to nest in the window of a bakery. Simple, ridiculous, normal. It made Noah laugh in spite of himself. The district office was the sort of building designed to feel both efficient and forgettable. Neutral carpeting, a low-voiced receptionist, an aquarium with a single goldfish. They were called into a small conference room with a table scarred by coffee rings. A woman with an ID badge that clipped to her blazer introduced herself as Leela Kearns and offered a glass of water. Her voice was slow and deliberate in a way that never felt theatrical, and she had the professional predilection for making notes while speaking. "Noah, Mara briefed me," she said. "We've received several communications and some supporting documents. Today is to go over what we have, to record your account, and to determine whether there are grounds to proceed with a formal investigation. We'll need to take a sworn statement." Hearing the phrase "sworn statement" pinched something in Noah's chest. He had never given a sworn statement in his life. The word had the antiseptic stiffness of a courtroom. But Sophie's hand found his under the table and squeezed. "We'll do it together," she whispered. Mara came in then, as if she had slipped in through the minutes while they were not looking. She wore a jacket that had absorbed late nights of research and an expression that balanced triumph and fatigue. "Thank you," she said quickly to everyone. "People read. They sent things."
"We can't promise outcome, but we can make this tidy and clear." The first hour was procedural. Names, addresses, the date of the alleged incident, the names of accusers and witnesses. Hannah set a folder on the table and slid a photograph across to Leela. A photo of a ledger page, a scan of the time-stamped transfer, an email exchange with a terse subject line. Leela nodded, fingers moving across her tablet. When they asked Noah to tell his story, he found that preparing for it had given him a surprising shape. He did not speak in a rush. He started at the place that felt clearest, the day he closed early, the time he left the shop, the errant text that made him check the receipts twice. He named people and places precisely because the small things were now his armor.
His voice trembled once on a detail about a bus route and then steadied when Sophie supplied the detail about the ledger, how she had looked at it during a lull and seen the entry that contradicted what had been said. They asked about motive. They asked if he had confronted the accusers, whether there had been threats, whether any of the documents were altered. Noah answered honestly. He would not stoop to altering records. He had no reason to invent a story. He remembered the exact phrasing of the text that had started the rumor, and when they asked to see his phone, he felt the old panic. But Mara already had copies, the threads of message and transfer printed and bound. Leela listened, then asked a question that tightened the room. Is it possible your presence at certain times could be misremembered by someone who only saw a figure at dusk? Do you have witnesses who can place you? Noah thought of the barista who had closed late and saw him with his coffee cup at 8, of the driver who had read him the number on a delivery ticket, of the contractor whose scrawl on a receipt had matched the ledger photo. He named names. Hannah slid their statements across. The room shifted when the investigator made a point of reading a line aloud from one of the printed emails, a line that seemed at first like a small thing but landed with the gravity of a keystone. It was the contractor's note. We were at the site all morning. I logged hours on the ledger. Noah shouted hello around 10:24 when he dropped in for change. No one had written shouted as a flourish. It simply anchored a time. We'll corroborate these, Leela said. We'll speak to these people directly. If their accounts are consistent, that will carry weight. At some point the matter of character came up, and that was awkward. How does one defend a life lived in a small city where gossip had been the shape of social currency? How did one answer, in a neutral room, the accusation that others had layered over him? Mara had anticipated this and had prepared a list of character references: landlords, customers, other shop owners. Ruby had asked a dozen people to write specific, plain statements, not florid odes to his goodness, but instances of time and place. They broke for lunch in the cafe attached to the office. They ate sandwiches while scrolling through messages that had come in overnight. A bus driver's succinct note, a photograph of the transaction history, a neighbor's recollection of a garden gate being shut. News gathered in this way felt like the hauling in of nets, small evidence, each unremarkable, becoming meaningful in some. In the afternoon, Leela made calls and scheduled interviews. One by one, people who had been listed as possible witnesses arrived and were ushered in. There was an older woman, Miss Alvarez, who ran a stationery shop on the next block. She smelled of lavender and told the investigator plainly that she had seen Noah 3 mornings that week buying stamps and paying cash. There was a man in a delivery uniform who, when asked, admitted he had mistaken another man's coat that first day, but then checked his manifest and found Noah's name on a ticket that he had signed. Each statement did not make the case in isolation, but they did what Hannah had hoped. They made rumor harder to sustain. Noah sat through the parade of small attestations and felt his chest unclench in increments. He listened when people spoke about him with a kind of ordinary kindness that carried no need to lionize. It was steadier for being plain. The contractor repeated the ledger detail under oath, and, when asked how sure he was, said, "I write my hours for the men. I remember because that morning we were under a deadline, and I don't sign falsely." Sometime near the end of the day, Leela asked for a closing, a brief summary of what Noah wanted the district office to do. He heard himself say, "I want them to see the pattern. I want the files checked for when the posts went out and who shared them, to see if anyone knowingly spread something false. I want the chance to clear my name." Mara, from the corner, translated his plea into procedural language. They would open an inquiry, compile the statements, and recommend whether the original accusation should be retracted or referred for further legal review. She made it sound tidy in the way lawyers make dangerous things sound safe, and Noah was grateful for the translation. As they left the building, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Outside, a teenager skateboarding by wiped out near the curb and stood to smile as the group watched. "You okay?" someone called, genuinely. The little exchange, wholly unrelated to the heavier matters, made Noah feel like the world was a place where incidents could be both calamitous and ordinary at once. Back at the shop, the mood was quieter than triumph, but not without warmth. Ruby brewed a pot and set another bouquet on the counter. Hannah began drafting a note for a possible social media post, not 50,000 followers worth, just a straightforward announcement that there would be an update as things progressed. Noah thought about it and realized he wanted to speak in a particular way, short, factual, and without rancor. He did not want to be the voice of a spectacle. He wanted his words to carry what they needed to carry. That night, he took the leash and walked to the park alone. City lights flared, and the air tasted faintly of rain that had not yet fallen. He had expected, perhaps naively, that the sense of dread would leave him now that the first, important step had been taken. Instead, it had thinned but not vanished. The meeting had been a hinge, and hinges do not by themselves close doors. They create the possibility that doors might be opened. He sat on a bench and watched the street sweepers methodically clear the curbs. A woman with a stroller passed and smiled. A dog barked in the distance. He fingered the edges of the printed documents in his jacket pocket. In the hush, he allowed himself to imagine a slow repair, mornings with customers who knew him, payment reconciliations that matched up, and acknowledgement from those who had shared the rumor that they had been mistaken. He allowed himself to imagine Sophie at the counter with a small, deliberate smile, Ruby bringing the morning bouquet, Hannah sending another succinct, efficient email. Days after, things proceeded in their measured way. The office called for further interviews. Leela requested copies of financial records from a few sources. A name that had been circulating as an instigator turned up in one of the inboxes Mara had been monitoring. A string of messages suggested hasty confirmations, then an abrupt silence when it became clear that someone had been looking for attention. It was not a neat narrative of villain and hero. It was something more complicated. Carelessness, the thrill of sharing, a willingness to accept a story without checking. Late one week, they received a letter from an attorney representing one of the accusers, offering to meet. Hannah read it aloud and then folded it carefully. "It could be posturing," she said. "It could be," she shrugged, "a chance to speak. We'll prepare." Noah's days reacquired texture. He busied himself with the shop, with coffee and ledger, and the small rituals that gave shape to time. But the question of belonging, once rattled, takes time to settle back into place. People who had been casual, a man who always ordered the same sandwich, a woman who came in for tea, offered quick, separate assurances. "We believed you. We knew it wasn't you." They were not grand gestures. They were the kind of acts that heal by accumulation. Then, on a rain-slimmed morning, Leela called him into the office again. "We have enough to open a formal inquiry," she said. "It will involve interviews, a review of the materials, and a recommended outcome."
It won't be quick, but it will be thorough. Her tone bore the weight of civics, meant to be calming, inevitable. Noah nodded. The slow justice he had been handed, paper and procedure, signatures and sworn statements, felt like a vessel he could climb into. Outside the window of the office, he saw people go about ordinary lives, bikes clipped to racks, an elderly couple navigating a crosswalk. He thought of the napkin son folded into his back pocket, of Sophie's hand on his sleeve, of Ruby's resilient flowers on the counter. He thought of the ledger photo, of the contractor's scrawl, of the bus driver's memory. The case ahead would not be decided by a single line of proof, but by the gathering of small truths until rumor could no longer hold them at bay. They left with a schedule. Interviews planned for the coming weeks, requests for documents to be fulfilled, a preliminary hearing penciled in for late spring. Noah stepped back onto the sidewalk, feeling both empty and expectant, as if he were waiting for a tide that would slowly, reliably come in. That evening, the shop filled with regulars who had not yet noticed the change, and those who had did their best to be ordinary in solidarity. Sophie made him a cup and set it down without a word. Hannah printed one more list and slid it across. A list of phone calls to be made, people to thank, follow-ups to send. Ruby placed a small card next to the till. "For when you feel small," it read, and inside she had written, in cramped letters, "You are not alone." Noah kept the card in his pocket and, when the shift ended, walked home under a sky that had finally given up its rain. The city, in its persistent, inexplicable way, felt able to hold both shadow and repair.
He did not know how the inquiry would end. He did not know how many people would remember clearly when asked the hard questions. What he did know, with a quiet, accumulating certainty, was that there were people who had seen, who would speak, who understood the currency of small, ordinary truths. That night, he lay awake for a while, thinking of the ledger and of how fragile reputations were, but also of how resilient they could be when the right people gathered to say plainly that did not happen. He imagined not a drama, but a slow counting out of facts until the balance tipped. When he finally slept, it was with a sense that, at least for now, the narrative had shifted from accusation to inquiry, from being acted upon to acting back, one careful step at a time. In the weeks that followed, new names arrived in Mara's inbox. A neighbor who remembered the exact shade of a coat, a teacher who could place Noah at a fundraiser, a delivery app's time log. Each small thing fell into the pile like a pebble into deep water. The ripples traveled outward. There were afternoons when Noah thought he could already taste a return to routine, and afternoons when the lingering sting of rumor made his hands ache as if from labor. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a man named Ellis came into the cafe. He was a retired mail sorter who had once been a fixture at morning routes and who moved with the careful deliberation of someone unhurried by the passage of decades. He had read a piece in the paper, a brief sidebar Mara had managed to place that spoke of the inquiry, and he had brought, folded into his wallet, a small slip of paper. "I don't know if it helps," he said, placing the slip on the counter and watching the way Noah's face shifted when he saw it. "But I remember schedules. That mark is from the morning route, and I remember seeing you in the light." He spoke without spectacle. His memory was a quiet thing. Noah took the paper, felt the weight of its ordinary proof, and for the first time in months felt a kind of relief so simple it was almost mundane. It was not vindication in the grand sense. It was the kind of clearing that comes when someone says, without amplification, the thing that needed to be said. They filed the slip, sent a note of thanks, and continued. The inquiry worked on its own slow, bureaucratic logic, and Noah learned the small patience of procedure, that truth could be patient and steady, and that sometimes the only way to remake a life was to keep setting down one fact after another until the picture was whole enough to be seen. Late that week, as the first heat of spring softened into a persistent warmth, Mara called Noah. Her voice, when she had something to say, contained a hint of the careful excitement of beginning to see a line take shape. "They're calling a preliminary review," she told him. "They want to hear you, to hear the other statements, to look at the timeline in public. It's not the end, but it moves things forward." Noah listened and felt the room of possibility widen by degrees. He thanked her. He thought of Sophie arranging sun napkins in a jar by the counter, of Ruby's bouquets in a chipped vase, of Hannah's lists folded into neat piles. He thought of all the small testimonies that people had given, the coffee cups emptied, the bus routes remembered, the ledger scrawl that had turned out to be a steady stitch of reality. As he closed up the shop that night, he felt tired in a way that was not exhaustion, but the heavy arm of a day that had been given a shape. He turned off the lights one by one, stacked the chairs, and walked the pavement to the door, leaving behind the small, ordinary things that had become his defense. A ledger, a napkin sun, a bouquet. Outside, the city hummed. Ahead, the inquiry would convene, and others would speak. For now, he allowed himself to carry on the small ritual of locking the door and walking home with the weight of the day behind him and a cautious, growing sense of possibility before him.